MaximumFun.org.
I'm really happy to be here, and I was given a very wide open agenda for this conversation. So the putative title of my talk was Finding the Extraordinary in the Ordinary, which I kind of like as a title. It also leaves it wide open. I always wanted to be a writer. I never went through the sort of ballerina phase or the school teacher phase or all the different phases or even the more mature phases of ideas of what I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer. So on one hand, I feel incredibly lucky to be doing what I dreamed about doing from the time I was about 5, which is sort of remarkable. It also may suggest a very limited imagination, but I always loved this idea that writing was magical. Reading, the idea that you look at a page and see little marks, and out of that comes emotions and experiences, a feeling you've been somewhere, feeling you learned something new. I mean, that's magical. And for me, being a writer and being a storyteller and having that same impact on other people always seemed remarkable. So I've been very lucky to do it and kind of amazed that I have found a profession that really matched the dream that I had, that it would feel in a certain way like magic. In junior high, I did take a career guidance test, and it suggested I would do well as either an Army officer or a forest ranger. What I always wondered about was not if I wanted to be a writer, but how to become the kind of writer I wanted to be. I didn't want to be a newspaper reporter because I lacked a fundamental thing that's important for newspaper writers, which is I never cared about knowing something first. I didn't want to write only about things that could be considered newsworthy. I just wanted to write about things that interested me and to write about them in a way that would surprise readers. And in one very important way, which was that they would find themselves surprised to learn that they could be interested in that thing too. Even then, I knew that you kind of could go one of two ways. One was to write about the things that you already knew people were interested in, or you could take that leap and write about things that people didn't even know they could be interested in. And while that sounds kind of odd, the number of times I've had people say to me, boy, I never thought I'd read a whole book about orchids. To me, that's a great compliment. There's a sort of missionary zeal in a lot of what I do, which was I love the idea that someone finds themselves learning about something they didn't think they cared about, or being intrigued by something they never imagined they could be interested in. And just not to get too serious, but just to add a dimension to that, I think if you look at the world and what is wrong with the world, one enormous piece of that is people's inability to imagine something outside of themselves. So any time in whatever form of work you might do, that you can take someone to a place where they find themselves able to empathize with or think about or be interested in something they didn't think they could be interested in, you've done something really important, even if it's a small subject. And I really, really believe it. And there are times when I feel like that, to me, is the single most important thing. Anytime anyone has an experience where they think, wow, I didn't think I could care about that, they've changed. And that change might take them in very important ways in their life to a different sense of who they are and what they can empathize with. Because that's where the world starts to fall apart, is the inability to imagine that you could feel any sympathy for another life other than your own. As I said, I don't want to get too serious, but I do think that is, to me, the most important thing that I can do. And having that moment where I feel a reader stepped into another world they didn't think they could find interest in, then I feel incredibly satisfied. That and the bestseller list. Those... Now, the subjects that I find myself drawn to are often what would be described as ordinary. And I kind of cringe when I use that word because it sounds negative, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that what I'm saying when I use the word ordinary is those subjects that don't immediately, they're low concept. They're not the subjects that you think are, someone's on that beat. In fact, I had a funny experience a couple of years ago. I was at a friend's house. He's a painter, and he was on a phone call, and I saw on his coffee table a book. I picked it up, and it turned out it was a catalog, and it was for taxidermy supplies, and it was this thick. And I thought, I can't believe it. I thought there was like one taxidermist in the world. And the idea that there was a supply catalog this thick, not only was there one, there were multiples, because when my friend came out and saw me reading through it saying, you can buy bear noses, you can buy molds for, beaver lips. This is amazing. And my friend said, oh, I don't even like that catalog that much. I prefer this one. And he had like 7 different companies providing taxidermy molds. And I thought, this is unbelievable. I went home that night. I Googled taxidermy thinking, okay, so maybe there isn't just one taxidermist. Maybe there are like 5. And of course there were, 2 million hits for taxidermy. And it turned out the World Taxidermy Championships were coming up. So the next day... Sometimes you get lucky. The next day, I ran into the New Yorker, burst into David Remnick's office, and I said, the World Taxidermy Championships are coming up. Can I go? And he sort of sat there, and he said, wait, let me think. I may have already assigned that. That's the kind of story that I love. And I'll tell you why I loved it. I loved it because, number one, this is a world that I had no contact with. I mean, we all see taxidermy here and there, but I had never thought beyond that, how it gets done, who does it. I had also assumed it was basically a lost art. People didn't do it anymore, except occasionally people would go get their deer mounted. And seeing that there was a championship was like, people compete? This is amazing. And the next thing I knew, I found myself in Springfield, Illinois, in a hotel that had been booked for the championship, so that when you'd stand waiting for the elevator and the door would open, usually there was a guy like holding a moose head or a bear, and it was really one of the world's greatest experiences. I'm not kidding. I mean, it was amazing. And I went into it not even knowing this world existed. I came out of it understanding that it's a world with history, with people, with rivalries, with schools of thought, with people who master it, with people who do incredibly crazy creative things, with wives very often who are really irritated because every time they open the freezer, there's like a dead beaver in the freezer because her husband's going to be working on it that evening and he didn't know where else to put it. I mean, I heard a lot of that. Or people who feel a tremendous amount of fulfillment because they've been trying to create icicles for their polar bear mount and they couldn't figure out a good way to do it and realize that if you melt toilet plungers, they make beautiful icicles. It's a world unto itself. So you don't have to travel far. You can go to Springfield, Illinois, and have an incredible experience. That, to me, is the great pleasure of doing stories like that. I came of age in journalism when writing about celebrities was the fast ticket to getting a lot of magazine assignments. Writing about exotic travel was the other fast ticket to getting a lot of magazine assignments. So I went in the contrarian path, which was to want to write about taxidermists in Springfield, Illinois. And it wasn't the easiest path, but it's one that I certainly was glad I did. I want to tell you one particular story about not taking that simpler path. Fairly early on in my career, I got a call from Esquire. You know, this is the dream. Esquire calls you and says, "We'd like you to write a story. We want you to profile Macaulay Culkin." You know, it's like good news, bad news. And I was thrilled. I mean, Esquire, my God, this was amazing. And yet, I don't know what's wrong with me. Just the idea of Macaulay Culkin did not excite me. He was 10 years old at the time. And they had already come up with a title for the story. It was going to be called The American Man, Age 10. I did something that I only can attribute to naivete and bravery, because I said to the editor, look, I'd love to write for Esquire, and I'd love to write a story that had the headline, American Man, Age 10. I don't, however, wish to profile Macaulay Culkin. I would, though, like to profile an ordinary 10-year-old boy. So my editor, to my amazement, said, okay, do that instead. Now, I'll come back to that because that in itself was a remarkable thing. But here's what happened next. First, I was elated. Then I was horrified because I thought, I have no idea what I'm talking about. And more than that, I thought, how can I write a story about an ordinary 10-year-old boy? What's there to say? In addition, and worse than either of those two examples of troubles, I thought, I don't know any 10-year-old boys. Now, I happened to be single at the time, and without much preamble, I was calling a lot of friends saying, do you know any 10-year-old boys? And it was like, no, why are you asking? And I would back up and say, oh, well, the professional reasons. And then I thought, well, I could go to a mall and find one. Then I thought, that's probably illegal. I've got to figure out another way to do this. And this is a funny thing about writing about ordinary subjects, which I do want to get to in a more general way. But the fact is, it's harder than writing these other high concept stories. It would have been really easy to write a story about Macaulay Culkin. His agent was ready. They had already negotiated an arrangement with Esquire. It's strangely harder to think, okay, I'm going to find an ordinary 10-year-old boy. It's also funny because by definition, there is no ordinary 10-year-old boy. Every 10-year-old boy is individual and particular. So suddenly it becomes very tricky. Like, how do you do that? I'll give you an example of one time where I was trying to solve the same problem, which was, excuse me, I wanted to write a story about life in a trailer park. And this was right after the Oklahoma City bombing. And every single profile of Timothy McVeigh mentioned that he lived in a trailer park. And at some point I said to my editor, you know, what does that mean? We just sort of deposit that phrase and it's freighted with all sorts of meaning, but I don't even know what it means. I've never spent time in a trailer park. So I'd like to go spend time in one to write about that, to sort of give us an idea of what that might imply. And he said, okay, which one are you going to go to? And I thought, well, I don't know. I mean, there are literally thousands. So my editor said, why don't you just throw a dart at a map? And the fact is that any one that you might hit is just as typical and atypical as any other one. And it was really a fascinating realization that picking an ordinary subject is in itself a complicated thing, and you have to do it knowing that, of course, nothing's typical. I mean, in the case of choosing a 10-year-old boy, I thought, I'd like to find a kid who lives in the suburbs because that is demographically typical rather than a kid who lives in Manhattan. And beyond that, you know, a kid in a family that doesn't have an exceptional fact about it that makes it very, very different from a normal average family. And I got lucky. I mean, through a friend of a friend of a friend, I got the name of a 10-year-old kid who lived in a suburb in New Jersey. His parents were school teachers, and to my delight, they sort of understood what I was doing. I said, I'm going to come and spend like 2 weeks just hanging out with Colin and going to school with him. And, you know, and they sort of said, it's up to him if he wants to do it. I met with him and he kind of shrugged, which is sort of the most eloquent response you could expect from a 10-year-old boy. I might point out that he had, in principle, agreed to this. And then I showed up on the Monday of the 2-week period that I had. And I was already getting kind of sweaty. I mean, first of all, I thought, what was so wrong with profiling Macaulay Culkin? I mean, that really would have been easier. Secondly, before I headed out on Monday, my editor at Esquire said to me, look, I don't want to pressure you, but this is going to be the cover story. Secondly, the whole rest of the magazine is already at the printer. We're just holding your space. And but I don't want to pressure you. I said, what's your definition of pressure? And he said, you know, I realize it's your first story for the magazine. And I thought, could you stop? Oh, you're trying to kill me. Anyway, I showed up at the Duffy's home on that Monday. And I was shunned. Suddenly, this 10-year-old boy probably took a second look, saw a grown woman who was about to go to school with him and thought, oh my God, what have I agreed to? So if you've never been shunned by a 10-year-old boy, I can tell you it's very painful. It's very embarrassing. I walked behind him to school, kind of shuffling like this. We got to the classroom. He wouldn't look at me. I sat in my little seat in the corner. It was going through adolescence all over again. But in this case, it was even worse because I was thinking, Esquire is holding the spot for me and you're shunning me? I mean, what am I going to do here? I went to school with him for 3 days where he literally would just kind of pretending he was disowning me. You know, and all the other kids in class were like, poking at me, like, who is she? What is she? And Colin was pretending that he had nothing to do with this. Finally, I think on the third day, right at the point where I thought, I'm going to have to call Esquire and say, is Macaulay Culkin still available? Because this didn't work. Suddenly, I think my pathos was so apparent that he took pity on me. And after school, he said, you want to come over? And I'll show you my room. And I thought, I'm in, thank God. So I just want to read you a short section from that story. If Colin Duffy and I were to get married, we would have matching superhero notebooks. We would wear shorts, big sneakers, and long baggy t-shirts depicting famous athletes every single day, even in the winter. We would sleep in our clothes. We would both be good at Nintendo, but Colin would be better than me. We would have some homework, but it would never be too hard, and we would have always just finished it. We would eat pizza and candy for all of our meals. We wouldn't have sex, but we would have crushes on each other, and magically babies would appear in our home. We would win the lottery and then buy land in Wyoming where we would have one of every kind of cute animal. All the while, Colin would be working in law enforcement, probably the FBI. Our favorite movie star, Morgan Freeman, would visit us occasionally. We would listen to the same Eurythmics song over and over and over and over and watch 2 hours of television every Friday night. We would both be good at football, have best friends, and know how to drive. We would cure AIDS and the garbage problem and everything that hurts animals. We would hang out a lot with Colin's dad. For fun, we would load a slingshot with dog food and shoot it at my butt. We would have a very good life. Thank you. Now, the reason that I like to go and talk about that story is that, you know, it was a leap that I made and that Esquire made that was risky. I made it because I just didn't think about the consequences. I thought, wow, I've got an assignment from Esquire, but I can't help but really want to do the story I want to do. And I was very lucky. I had an editor there who was pretty brave. And I know that sounds funny, but magazines don't generally do that sort of thing. You don't sell thousands and thousands of copies of Esquire because there's an unknown kid from a suburb in New Jersey being profiled. You sell them because Macaulay Culkin is in them. And I will say they put him on the cover. And people might have thought, oh, cool, a Macaulay Culkin profile, and then open it up and it's this kid in New Jersey. But it's interesting to me that that piece of mine has been anthologized and reprinted more than probably anything else I've ever written. So what's the lesson? Because I think there's a lesson here beyond the simple thing, which is that it's really kind of great to be naive enough to try to do the stuff you want to do and not appreciate the risk involved. But also, it made me realize that in general, we underestimate people's interest in ordinary life. It isn't easy to write a story like that. It's not easy to ever do stories about things that are ordinary. The execution is far more important. If you're writing a story about something that you know people are interested in, they're dying to learn about it, a murder, a celebrity, you don't even have to try very hard. There's just a built-in interest factor. It's like driving past a car wreck. I mean, we just can't help it. There's certain things we're interested in. It doesn't have to be done that well. If you're writing a story about something that requires you as a reader to be truly seduced into believing it's worth your time, then the execution matters an awful lot. And that's why editors are so nervous about it. And television producers and, you know, movie producers, the people who make those decisions, because they know that those stories are a lot harder to do, because if you don't do them well, they can be terrible failures, whereas a bad story about Macaulay Culkin is just one of many, many bad stories about Macaulay Culkin, and they're all kind of interesting in their own weird way because we are kind of interested in celebrity regardless. My own son walked out on my... Oh my God. That's it. I'm done. I have nothing more. Oh God. Next thing I know, he'll unfriend me on Facebook. What I want to do is really two things, and I kind of want to shift into something a little bit more practical here. and then also read you one other short thing. But I really want to make a plea for all of you to, anytime you can, make that choice. And know that it's the harder choice, but I think that people want those stories. People want those movies. And they want that kind of material. It has to be done really well. But the more it's done and the more we build up an audience that has been trained, in a sense, to listen to those things and read those things and know and go into them with an open mind, the better it is. It's not easy to convince the people who make decisions about this stuff to let you do it. And I'm very, very, very often asked, okay, so how do you get to do the story about taxidermy, to do the story about Macaulay Culkin? Or not, excuse me, about Macaulay Culkin. And so that's where I want to talk about, it's one thing to say, well, I'm passionate about that. It's another to be practical and say, so how do you make that happen? Most editors would have a heart attack if you said, I want to do a story about the taxidermy championships. They'd say, that's not on our market survey. We have very few taxidermy fans among our readers. I mean, and I can tell you at the New Yorker, that would probably have been the case, that the average New Yorker reader probably doesn't mount beavers. That's a sentence you've never heard before, right? And I've never uttered before. So number one, it's not that I came out of the box as a new writer doing those sorts of stories. I think part of, I teach a fair amount, and part of what I talk to students about is you build up a relationship, a portfolio, enough confidence in the people who hire you to say, look, give me a chance. Let me try that thing that is a little bit off your market survey. So you can't expect to do that immediately. And I think editors quite reasonably are sort of scared off if you introduce yourself and say immediately, okay, I'm going to write about something, belly button lint. It's a really good story. And they think, well, but that's a hard story to write. And that's, I think, the important thing to understand is that these are hard, and going into those kinds of stories, understanding that editors aren't just big jerks who won't let you do what you want, but they very reasonably have a kind of wariness of sending someone out on a story that has no narrative immediately apparent, that doesn't have a built-in sort of punch that is going to attract readers, that doesn't necessarily have any appeal to a general reader. So I don't look at editors as being the demons who are trying to keep me from doing these marvelous stories. I think they're just very understandably standing in the position of, how is this going to work? How is that a story? How is the story about an average kid going to work? And when you're in the middle of that kind of writing, you ask yourself those same questions. Believe me, there is not a point ever when I'm working on a story that I don't stop midway through and think, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm writing a story about an average kid living an average life. What's the story? What's the arc? So what is it? It always comes back to one thing only. And this is the only thing I think you can cultivate in yourself, which is your own authentic desire to know. Your own truly genuine desire to see other worlds, other lives, other subcultures. And that's the narrative. It's, I'm an explorer, just the way people were explorers in the 1800s, going to places other people couldn't go. Now everybody can go everywhere, except one place they can't go is inside other people's lives. That still remains something that a smaller set of people who have chosen that as their professional life still can do, to go dig into those places, those little pockets that end up, to my mind, unfolding into something really quite marvelous. What's kind of amazing to me is that I've had plenty of criticisms of my work over the years, which, entirely expected. But rarely does someone say, I have not very often had the criticism of, well, it's so boring. Who cares about a 10-year-old kid? That would seem to be the most natural criticism, right? That would be the thing that you'd fear, which is that people would say, well, who cares? He's just a 10-year-old kid. Because at the bottom, we really are interested in real lives, not in that sort of fakey way that has become, you can always tell when a newspaper editor has said, we need a feature, go find someone. And it's got that packaged feel. It's not really driven by anyone's actual interest in something. It's just, what's a cute feature? Oh, there's a guy who's, making donuts at the corner. We'll go talk to him. And there really isn't any true passion on the part of the writer. And I doubt there's any passion on the part of the editor. It's just a feeling that time to plug in a feature that's kind of soft. That doesn't, I'm happy to say, that never comes up for me because I really am interested in this stuff. I mean, it struck me that I really didn't know a 10-year-old boy as a person. That, someday I would have a kid who would be 10, and I was at one point 10, but I didn't know what his world felt like to him. And I was genuinely curious about it. And it was far crazier and more exotic, more magical, more foreign to me than a travel piece could have been. I mean, it was a world that I've never imagined going into. So it was absolutely wonderful. I want to read a little tiny bit from one other piece because, a lot of times the things that I love to write about are truly, a 10-year-old boy in New Jersey wasn't exotic except once I went in his world. His life was not exotic, but a lot of times what I do try to discover are subcultures that might be right next to me, but they are closed off because of reasons of race or socioeconomic divide, or, there's so many subcultures just within a close range. And so those stories fascinate me as well. So I'm just going to, before we open to questions, read a very short section from probably the most gratifying story, story I've ever written. I love gospel music, and I decided that I wanted at some point to write about a gospel group, not a crossover group that was known to mainstream music, but just I had learned sort of coincidentally that there's a gospel circuit that groups travel and they perform in very small arenas around the country. And it's almost like a religious revival circuit. And through a series of lucky accidents, I got hooked up with a group in Jackson, Mississippi called the Southern Airs. And they let me travel with them for a couple of weeks. And it was really one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. So it convinced me that writing about the worlds that are right in front of our very eyes, but we never quite had a moment to look or had access to, it will never be anything less than marvelous, because those worlds are so different from our own, and it's such a privilege to step into them. I just want to read this short section, and the group again is called the Jackson Southerners. On the road, at truck stops and diners, we ate Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, Reese's Pieces, sour cream and onion, Pringles potato crisps, Three Musketeers, chicken, baked, simmered, stewed, smothered, potted in pies or creamed a la king, chicken fried steak, chicken fried chicken, chicken even for breakfast sometimes if we traveled all night after a show and never got dinner. Arriving in Columbus, Georgia, after driving since midnight, we had baked chicken at 10 in the morning, which was the earliest I'd ever eaten chicken in my life. Now and then, when I was with the Southerners, I felt we spent more time arranging to eat, stopping to eat, ordering food to go, waiting to eat, and eating than we did at gospel shows. The night I began my travels with them, we left Jackson, drove about 12 miles, then pulled off at a truck stop and had dinner. It was 1:45 in the morning. None of the Southerners understood why I found this odd. The truck stop was fairly empty, and the 9 of us spread out at 5 or 6 tables. So when Huey, the lead singer of the group, said grace, our amens ping-ponged around the dining room. At the concerts, I saw men wearing spats and women wearing hats such as I'd never seen before. A black pork pie with a turquoise veil and bow, a midshipman's white cap with little pearls sewn along the rim, a tricorn of orange file, a red saucer that had netting looped around the edge, and a piece of stiff fabric shaped like a Dorito sticking straight up from the crown. The hats were on elderly ladies who moved through the crowds like cruise ships. Teenage girls came to the concerts too, in flowered dresses or in jeans and tank tops, wearing their babies slung on their hips the way hikers wear fanny packs, or jouncing them absent-mindedly like loose change. I heard people at gospel concerts call eyeglasses helpers, and a gravel road a dirty road. And I heard an infant called a lap baby, and a gun called a persuader, and dying called making it over, and an embarrassed person described as wanting to swallow his teeth, and a dead person described as someone who is having his mail delivered to him by groundhogs. Everyone talked about Jesus all the time. He was called a doctor, a lawyer, a lily of the valley, a lamb, a shepherd, joy in the morning, a rock, a road, peace in the evening, a builder, a captain, a rose of Sharon, a friend, a father, and someone who was always on time. I met a man named Porkchop and a man named Midget. I heard other gospel groups perform. The Christian harmonizers and the sensational harmonizers and the harmonettes and the religiousettes and the gloriettes and the gospel true lights and the true gospel singers and the brotherhood gospel singers and the 5 singing sons and the mighty sons of glory and the fantastic disciples and the fantastic solinaires and the brown boys and the blind boys and Wonder Boy and the spiritual voices. The concerts were like big public conversations. What people called out to the singers most often was, take your time and let him use you. What the singers called out most often was, do you believe in Jesus? And can I get just one witness? And are you with me, church? And, God is able. In Madison, Georgia, the Southerners performed as part of a program given in a school auditorium. As soon as the concert began, a tiny woman in a peach-colored pantsuit got up from her seat and made her way over to the aisle. And then she spiraled around for about an hour, gasping, thank you, Jesus, with her eyes squeezed shut and her hands flapping in the air. On the stage, a local group was performing, and one of the singers had raised her arms and turned her palms toward her face as she sang. She had 6 fingers on each hand, and each nail was painted coral pink. After the song, she leaned over the edge of the stage and said sharply, isn't Satan busy? Satan's a stubborn old mule. I remember when I would lay out all night on what they call the disco floor. Then something hit me on the head. The voice I heard, it was just like threading a needle. I saw only one white person besides myself at one concert. She was the desk clerk at the motel where we were staying, and Huey told her if she gave us good rooms, he'd give her a free ticket. Huey introduced me to the audience one night, and afterwards someone passed me a note that said, "We welcome you to Madison, Georgia. Love, Hattie." I read it and looked up, and the woman who had written it fluttered her handkerchief at me, and then during the next song, she crossed the room and kissed me. Thank you. Thank you.